Hello everybody, welcome to the first video on how to design a modern website. In this video, we're going to be taking the banned web pages that we created in the Introduction to HTML course and style the About page to look exactly as this image on the right here. To give you an idea of what we're starting with, over here is going to be our About page that we have currently designed with just the HTML and no CSS. Also, as a side note, before watching this video, if you know nothing about CSS, make sure you watch my Learn CSS in 20 Minutes video in order to get primed on what you'll need to know in order to watch this video and follow along. Now let's get started into the CSS design for this page. The first thing I want to note is that I've added a fonts folder into our project and included the two fonts that we're going to be using to style some of our elements. I also, in our images folder, changed our bandmembers.png to be a square image so that it'll fit perfectly inside of a circle, and I changed our footer images, the Facebook logo, Spotify logo, and YouTube logo, to be white instead of black so that they're going to show up on top of our light blue background that our footer will have. Now that we have that out of the way, let's create our CSS file that we're going to be writing all of our code in. We're just going to call this styles.css. Then, inside of our about.html page, in the head, let's add in a link, give it a rel of style sheet, and an href of style.css. Now if we save that, nothing over here will change because we don't actually have anything loaded into our styles.css. But to test this, let's just give our HTML a background color, and we'll make it red. If we save that, perfect. Our background changes to red, which means that everything in our styles.css is being loaded into our about.html page. Now let's clear that out of the way and get started. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to style the header portion of our site. If we go into our about.html page here, we see that in our header we have our navigation, which is these three buttons at the top here, as well as our header for the generics, which is our band name. The very first thing that we're going to do is give our header element a background image that is equal to the background image that you see over here. In order to do that, let's first give our header a class, and we'll just call it main header. In our styles.css, we'll use a selector to select that class, and then use the background image property to set an image for our background. Now this background image property works very similar to the href for an anchor tag. We'll use URL, and then inside of the URL, we'll specify where our image comes from. In our case, the image comes from our images folder over here, this header background.jpg. So we'll just put inside of here, images / header background.jpg. If we save that and go back to here, we'll see that our image is going to be behind here. Right now this doesn't quite look right though. In order to fix that, we're going to use the background size property and set this to cover. What this is going to do is it's going to tell the background to expand as much as it can until one of the borders is at the very edge of either the width or the height, so it'll expand either as wide as it can or as tall as it can until it can't get any larger without surpassing the size of the image. So if we save that, you see that our image has expanded all the way as wide as it can and as tall as it can, and the last edge to hit is the width. This is the full width of our image, and it cut off the top and the bottom of our image. That's exactly what we want our image to do. This means that if we resize our page, our image will grow and shrink as needed without us having to enter any extra code. As you can see in our example photo, the background image has a slightly darker hue to it than over here, so in order to do that, we're going to add a second background. This time we're going to use a background color, and we're going to set it to RGBA, and we'll just use black with a 60% transparency. Now if we save that, you'll see that nothing actually changed about our background. This is because by default you can only use either a background color or a background image. To get around this, we're going to use what's called background blend mode. This is essentially telling the browser how do you want to blend these two different backgrounds together, and we're going to use multiply which is essentially just going to combine these two together over top of each other. And as you can see on the right, we now have a grayish dark color to our background instead of it just being entirely opaque. Now, all we need to do is add a little bit of padding underneath of this lettering down here so that we match the spacing we have over here. And to do that, we can just use padding bottom, and we'll set it to something like 30 pixels. If we save that, we now have a nice gap on the bottom here. You may also notice that around our background image, we have some white spacing between here, even though in our about.html, this is the very first thing in our body. This is because CSS styles are being defaulted onto certain elements such as the HTML element and the body element. If we go into our style sheet, and at the very top here just put HTML and body as our two selectors, and we set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0, we save that, we'll see that now those margins and paddings go away on the side here. But we still have a margin on the top. This is because our UL element also has a default margin on the top. So if we go in, set our UL element to have a margin of 0 as well, and save that, you now see that our background takes up the entire width and goes all the way to the very top of our page. Generally though, you don't want to style using elements such as getting rid of the margin on all ULs. So in our about here, we're going to give our nav a class of nav to indicate that this is our navigation. And in here, we use the nav class that we just created, followed by UL to say that all the ULs inside of the nav will now have no margin. If we say that, this will look exactly as before, but now all of our normal ULs will still have a margin, but the ULs inside of a navigation class will not have a margin. Now before we get started on styling the nav, we're going to want to use the everything selector to set a few general styles that will apply to all the elements in our HTML. The first one that we're going to want to use is box sizing, and we're going to want to set this to border box. What this does is it makes it so that the size of our elements are determined by the padding and the margin as well as the actual size of the content. So if we had a box and we set the width to be 200 pixels and we set the padding to be 20 pixels, without border box, the width of that object would be 200 pixels wide plus 20 pixels on the right for padding and 20 pixels on the left for padding, making it 240 pixels wide. With border box though, the width attribute takes into account the padding as well. So if we set a width of 200 pixels, our element will be exactly 200 pixels wide, and the padding will be on the inside of those pixels. If that doesn't make any sense, we'll be able to see more examples of this as we continue on styling this page. Another attribute that we want to apply to all of our elements is going to be our font family. This will be the default font family that all of our text is going to use. In our case, we're going to use the Railway font, but since this font is not a generic font that can be used on websites, we need to import this font. In order to do that, we're going to use Google Fonts and import it using this URL. This URL can be found on the Google Fonts webpage, and you can search for any font on there that you want, and then all you have to do is click on that font, click the import, and it'll give you this link to copy and paste into your CSS. Now if we save this, you'll see all of our font will change to Railway. The last thing that I want to apply to all of our elements is a default text color. In general, black on white is very high contrast and can be tiresome on your eyes to read, so I like to use a more subtle text color of 777 here, which is just going to be a light gray, which is much easier on the eyes to read. Now that we have that out of the way, let's style our navigation element. First, let's go to our about.html and remove this HR tag. This HR tag was only there to add an underline for our navigation, but we'll do that in CSS as borders are much easier represented in CSS. I also want to give our navigation another class of main nav. This is because we will have multiple different types of navigations that we want to style similarly, but we only have one main navigation that's going to be at the top of our page. So now if we go back to our styles.css, let's style our actual nav class first. We've already made it so that the margin is 0, so that our nav will no longer have any margins around it, but we want to maybe make our elements so that they are in line with each other as opposed to on separate lines as they are over here. To do this, we'll select the nav element, and then we'll select the li elements under that nav, and we will give them a display of inline. This tells us that the browser should render all of these elements in line with each other as opposed to on separate lines, which is the default for a list. Next, we want to style the actual links themselves that are in our navigation element. To do this, we want to give them some padding. So let's say we'll use a padding of 0.5 em, which will just space out these elements a little bit from each other. We also want to give them a white text color to match our mockup that we have of our image. And then lastly, we want to set it to text decoration none, which will remove that underline from underneath of our elements over here. And if we save that, we see that our text decoration has removed the underline from these elements, changed the color to white, but our padding has only added padding to the left and right, and not the top and bottom, as padding should do when you give it just one number. This is because these are inline elements, and inline elements cannot apply padding on the top or bottom. What we need to do is we need to change the display to be inline block. Inline block is very similar to inline, except for it allows you to do certain things such as add padding and height to elements that inline elements do not allow you to do. So now as you see, we have padding on the top, bottom, left, and right of all of these elements due to being inline block. The last thing we want to do is we want to make it so that it is easy to tell which element we're hovering over to give the user some feedback. To do this, we'll style the A tag again, and we'll use the hover selector to say when we hover over the element, we want to do something. And all we want to do is change the background color, and we'll just use a light grayish color here. So we'll use white. But we'll use transparency of 30%. So the white will show mostly as gray. And as you can see, when we hover over these elements, we are now getting a background color that tells us, hey, this is being hovered. This is all the styles that we want to apply to our general navigation though. Now we want to move on to our main nav gloss, because this is going to be styles that are applied to only the main navigation and not all of our other navigations. The first thing that we want to do is we want to make it so the text will be in the center of our screen, since our navigation should be centered at the very top of the screen. We also want to make it so the font size is a little bit bigger so it is easier to read. We'll just use 1.1 em, which will make it about 10% bigger. And then we'll change the font weight to be lighter as opposed to the stronger font weight, so that way it blends a little bit better into the background. And then lastly, we want to add a border bottom to our element to replace that HR that we deleted. And it'll be 1 pixel wide, completely solid, and we'll just use another light gray color here. And if we save that, we now see that we have a border on the bottom and our elements at the very top. The last thing that we need to do is space out our elements from each other, because right now they're very close to each other. To do this, we'll use the main nav again, and we'll select the LI elements, and we'll just give them a little bit of padding. So we'll say padding of 0 on the top and bottom, and 5% on the left and right. There we go. Now our elements are spaced out from each other, and as our screen grows, the elements stay spaced out from each other, and as it shrinks, they stay spaced out again. The last thing we have to style on our header is going to be the actual name of the band here. If we go back to our mockup over here, you see that this is going to be much larger and of a completely different font than we have right here by the default. So to do this, let's go back to our About page, and let's add a class here, and we'll just call it band name. We'll also add a second class of band name large, because we have 2 instances where our band name will be rendered. Once in the header, where it is very large, and a second time in the footer, where it is a more normal size. This is why we are going to use this band name class to style all of the elements that we need to make the band name look good, and then this band name large class to make the band name in the header larger. Let's first start with the just normal band name class. In this class, we're going to first want to make the text align center. This will cause it to appear in the center of the screen. And then we want to remove all margins from this element, because H1 elements by default have margin. If we save that, it'll get squished a little bit closer together. And then we want to increase the font size. And since this is just going to be our normal band name and not the large one, we're just going to use this font size of 4em and save that. Then we want to change the font family. This font family is going to be Booter 0, 0, but if we save that, you'll see on my local machine this updates to be the correct font. That's because I have Booter 00 installed on my computer. Normally, this will not be the case, especially when you upload your website to be hosted somewhere else. In order to load this style in, we first want to grab our font files here, and we want to import them using the @fontface property. In here, we want to use the font family. This essentially tells our browser what name do we want to use for this font. We are going to use Booter 00. This is the name that you will set when you set the font family down here. Then we need the source. This essentially tells the browser where is this font coming from. This is just like the background image URL. So we're going to use fonts/booter00, and we'll use the first one here, the WOFF, and tell it that this format is WOFF. Then we want to import our other source, which is URL fonts booter00 WOFF2. Let me get rid of these backslashes here. And we'll use the format of WOFF2. This tells the browser that we have these two different types of fonts here, the Booter00 WOFF and Booter00 WOFF2, and it tells it which format is each one. The reason we have multiple sources is because some browsers don't support all types of sources, such as WOFF2 or just the normal WOFF. So now with having multiple sources here, the browser will take the very first source, and if that one works, it'll use it. And then if that one's not acceptable, it'll go down to the second source here. Lastly, we want to put a font weight, which tells us what weight is this font, and it is just normal. And same with font style. This is just a normal font, not italics or anything, so we'll put normal here. Now we have that font loaded into our page, so we have Booter00 that is normal and normal styled. But over here, you see that our font is bolded and doesn't quite look the same as our mockup. This is because H1 tags by default bold their font. To get around this, we're going to set the font weight to be normal, and if we save that, our font now looks exactly as it does over here. The last thing we need to do is set the color of the font to be white, and if we save that, this now looks almost exactly the same as our mockup does over here. And that's everything that we need to do, except for this font is a little bit too small. This is why we use that band name large class. Inside of the band name large class, we're going to set the font size, and we're going to make it 9em. If we save that, that is now going to be much larger, and it is going to look almost identical to how large it is over here. And if you want, you can play around with this number, make it 8em for example, and save it, and it'll look great either way. Now that we have the header completely styled, let's move on to styling the section content of our web page. Over in the about.html page, let's add a class to our section, and we're just going to call this content section. Essentially clarifying that this section is just for content, and we can reuse this on all of our other content sections across our index and our store page. I also want to give it a class of container, which we will use to specify a maximum size as well as some paddings on the outsides of our text, so that way it's not quite squished up all the way against the edge of the screen. Back in styles.css, let's use the .content section class that we just created and give it a margin of 1em. This will give us a little bit of spacing on the top, left, right, and bottom of our element, so that way it distinguishes itself from the previous element. Then we'll use our .container class that we just created, and in here we'll style a max width, which says that the max width of our element is going to be 900 pixels wide. This means if our element tries to get any larger than 900 pixels, it'll just stay at 900 pixels. If I save that and increase my screen size, you can see that this element stops at 900 pixels. But as you saw, it was showing up on the left side instead of centered. To center it, we're going to set the margin on top and bottom to 0, and then we're going to use auto as the left and right margin. This tells it that the margins on the left and right will be as large as they need to be and will be exactly the same, so that way the text will be always in the center. And if we bring this all the way over to the side, you'll see that we have a large margin on the right and left, which centers our text on the middle. And then lastly, we just want to add a little bit of padding back to this container to push it away from the sides, so we'll use 0 on the top and bottom and 1.5 EM on the left and right in order to give us a little space so that our text does not run right up against the edge of our web page. Next, we need to style the actual heading for this element. We can use another class on our H2 here, and we'll just call it section header. There we go. This is because all of our sections are going to be styled with the same exact header, so we will use this class again on our home page and our about page. Now in our styles.css, let's grab that section header class, and in here we're going to just use a font family, and this font family is called Metal Mania, which again is not on the computer by default, so we have to use another import URL from Google Fonts, and this import URL, like I said before, you can find by going onto the Google Fonts webpage and searching your font. This is what the URL is going to be for the Metal Mania font, and if we save that, you see that our text changes. You can also see that we have the same problem where our text is bolded as it was over here in the generics, so we'll just change the font weight to be normal. And now if we save that, you'll see that our text is no longer bolded, but it still doesn't look exactly as we want it to. And this is because we need to change the color on this to be slightly darker. We'll use just 333, which is about halfway between our light gray and completely black. And then we want to center this text in the middle of our screen, text align center. And if we save that, you'll see that our section header is now in the middle of our screen. It's the right color, but it's slightly too small, and we'll use the font size property 2.5 EM to make it about 2.5 times bigger. Save that, and there we go. Our heading is perfect. Now the next element we need to take care of is the image in our about section. As you can see on here, the image is a circle, and it's displayed towards the top of our text. And the text just flows perfectly around the image, no matter how large or small the image is. In order to do this, let's first add a class to our image, and we'll just call it our about band image, because this is a class we're only going to be using for our about band. And then in here, select that about band image. And now in order to make it so that our text flows around this image, what we want to do is we want to use the float property and tell it to float left. This means that the image will remove itself from the flow and float completely to the left side of the document. Also, as you can see, our image is quite large here, so let's give it a height of 200 pixels and a width as well of 200 pixels. And if we save that, you see that our text is flowing perfectly around this, but we want it to flow from the top. So in our about here, let's move our image above our p tags and save it. And now, as you can see, from the very start of our text, it is flowing around the image. But our text is right up against our image, and we don't want this. In order to fix this, let's give our image 15 pixels of margin on all sides in order to push the text away from the image. Lastly, in order to create a circle, we're going to use the border radius property. This property tells us how far we want to curve the edges of our border, and in our case, 50% will make a perfect circle since we curve from 50% all the way to the next 50%. So if we save that, we have a perfect circle with our text flowing around it as we expected. If we go over here, as you can see, it doesn't quite look exactly the same because our image is not at the very center of our text, it's at the very top, but it's much easier to style from the very top of the text, and I personally think it even looks better this way. As for the actual text of our content, we don't need to change anything because in our generic everything selector, we already set the font family and color to be exactly the same as what is over here. So the last thing we have left to do is address the footer, which we want to use a light blue background around with our band name on the left, as well as our 3 elements on the right for our buttons to go to YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook. In order to do this, we're going to need to supply some classes to the footer. We're going to use the class of main footer, similar to how we used main header, to specify that this is the main footer on our web page. Then we're going to use the band name class and apply that to our band name. And if we save that and go back here, you'll see that our band name has already updated to be white text and the correct font and font color and font size, just because we already created that band name style before, which is the power of using classes, since they're so reusable to create many different elements and just copy and paste them along your page as you see fit. So now let's go back to our styles.css and style that main footer element. Our main footer is overall very simple. All we need to do is add a background color that's going to be that light blue color here, which I just copied over. And then we're going to make all of the text in this main footer white, so we're going to use a color of white. And then lastly, we want to have a little bit of padding between our elements and the edge of the background, so we'll use a padding of 0.25 em on the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. And if we save that, scroll down, you see that we now have that light blue background, as well as all of our text is white. But we have the problem of our footer being stacked vertically when we want it to be stacked horizontally. In order to fix this problem, we're going to go back to our about.html, and we're going to use a second div element in here with the class of container and main footer container that will wrap all the content inside of our footer. There we go. And now in our styles.css, we'll make the main footer container. The purpose of this main footer container is to wrap our elements in a display flex element. A flex display, or also known as flexbox, is a very complex layout element that you can use in CSS, but we're only going to skim over the top of it because in this video we don't have the time to cover the full complexities of flexbox. But in the future, I will make a video covering Flexbox in depth. If we scroll down here, we see that already our elements have lined up next to each other on the left and the right, which is great. But we want our right side element to take up as much space as possible, while our left side element should be as small as possible. In order to do this, we'll make it so that main footer container, the UL inside of it, which is our navigation on the right here, we want it to grow to take up as much space as possible, so we'll use flex grow and give it a value of 1 to tell it to grow. And then we also want to align our text in that element to the end of the element, so we'll use text align end to tell our text to be on the right side instead of the left side. We also want it so that our YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook links will be centered with this band logo on the left here. To do this, we'll use the align items property and set it to center to center everything vertically inside of this flexbox. Next, all we need to do is style our navigation, which we've already created a class for. So on our UL, we'll add a class of nav, as well as footer nav, so that we can use specific stylings for our footer and save that. As you can see, it has already changed so that we have the background hover and the elements have lost their period on the left side, denoting that it's a list item. Now all we need to do in here is change our footer nav li so that we have a different set of padding around these elements. We'll use a padding of 0 on the top and bottom and 0.5 em on the left and right to give these elements a little bit of space around each other. Next, we're going to make it so the images are going to be quite a bit smaller than they are right now, since they're a bit oversized. So we'll use the footer nav, select all the images, give them a width of 30 pixels and a height of 30 pixels. And if we save that, we see that now everything is center aligned together inside of the footer. Our images are smaller. They have the hover element, which is the same from this navigation up here, and they also allow us to click them and go to their links. The great thing about this web page is that it's also responsive on different sizes. So if we increase the size of our page, you see that everything flows great around each other without breaking. Everything's working, everything looks great, whether it's full size or small. It doesn't matter, it'll work flawlessly. This web page is, though, not designed specifically with mobile sizing in mind, so it doesn't look as good on a small screen size as it does on a slightly larger screen size, but either way, it looks great no matter which size the browser is at. And that is all there is to creating the About band page for this website. We have all the style-ins so that our page looks almost exactly the same as the mockup that we had before, and it is even scalable to different browser sizes, and it looks good on all those different sizes. The best part about this is since that we used very generic named classes such as container, band name, and nav, we're able to apply these classes to the rest of our pages, such as the home page here and the store page here, in order to get a head start without having to restyle the elements such as this navigation and the footer every single time. If you guys want to follow along with this project and use the exact same code that I have to style this About page here, all this code is going to be available on my GitHub, which will be linked in the description below. From there, you can get these font files that I'm using, as well as the different logos and background images that I'm using, and even the actual code for this video is available on my GitHub. If you guys enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, and let me know down below how your styling of the About page for your band website goes after watching this video. Thank you guys very much for watching.